if that works, we can go ahead and just,
Yeah.
I'm excited to talk about the book.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
excited.
Yeah.
It's
We're good to go.
Yeah. Okay, great. Okay. So tell me about This Is Chance. Tell me about the book. What is it about?
yeah.
That kind of thing for the record.
Yeah. So This Is Chance is about the 1964 earthquake in Alaska, the Good Friday earthquake or the Great Alaskan Earthquake, depending on who you ask, which nickname they like. And it's mostly a narrative book that tells the story of the quake in Anchorage during the first 3 days. So the earthquake happens on Good Friday, and the story takes you from Good Friday through the end of Easter Sunday. And it's focused around a woman named Jeannie Chance, who was a radio reporter at a radio station in Anchorage, a working mother who was a part-time broadcaster, who wound up both through a kind of quirk of circumstance, but also through her own tenacious personality, being a really central node for information in the city. She stayed on the air almost the entire weekend, both broadcasting information from city authorities and also working to connect people who'd been separated in the kind of pandemonium after the quake. And fortunately for me, a lot of this was documented by researchers at the Disaster Research Center. It was their sort of first full-scale field work. What's the quick response?
Yeah.
And so they were in Anchorage within I think it was 27 hours of the earthquake. The first people were on the ground, and would go on to interview 500 different people in Alaska, most of them in Anchorage, many of them within a few days after the quake. And those interviews became a real basis for a lot of the narrative of the book in terms of helping me reconstruct who was doing what when, and what it felt like to be there. And also, very fortunately, as a journalist, it kind of gave the book a real kind of intellectual underpinning, because this was a case study where a lot of what sociology knows about disasters was really apparent right from the get-go. So as they were thinking through what they were seeing in Anchorage, the book got to think through it as well.
That's great. And then what started your interest in this? What led you to write this book in the first place? How did you learn about the story?
Yeah, so there's a long version and a short version, and I'll try to do the long version short, which is basically, I'd never heard of this earthquake before. I grew up on the East Coast. I was born in 1978. And even by then, it seemed to have, I mean, even right away, a couple of years after the quake, I found accounts of Alaskans saying, no one even remembers what happened to us, and it was, 1968 or something. So maybe I had heard it mentioned in school or something like that, but I had never heard of it. And I was actually camping in the early 2000s in a Crescent City, which was, and started to hear stories about a tsunami there. And I just sort of, lodged that in my memory. And years later, now I'm a journalist, and I was looking for things to write, and I remembered that. And it occurred to me, I didn't even know why there was a tsunami there. It turns out there was a tsunami there because of this earthquake. And that was my very first inkling, or when the earthquake first impressed itself on me. And I think I was really, that alone was really intriguing to me. How could something so catastrophic, the most powerful earthquake in North America, be something I'd never heard of? And I very quickly found out about Jeannie, and I heard she was on the radio, and I thought, well, there's got to be, I wonder if there's recordings of that. And it turned out that her daughter had saved 38 boxes of her materials, including many, many hours of real recordings and diaries and letters from throughout her life, but especially also through that period of time. So I could not do this book. I think this is the archivist in me felt was activated, and it just didn't even seem like a choice after a while.
That's great. So tell us about Jeannie Chance.
So
the
Jeannie,
book, of course, her name. And
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, that was also just sort of a freakish thing that really was sort of the story that seemed to be emerging, was one just about sort of the intransiency of things and how arbitrary these kinds of disasters can feel. But Jeannie was like a lot of people living in Anchorage at that time, had come up from the lower 48. She was originally from Texas, and there was a real sense of like starting over among many people who were moving to Alaska there. She moved up with her husband Winston, who was a used car salesman. They had 3 kids, and she was, in some ways, she was really ahead of her time in terms of like when you read her accounts of her life during that time, she's dealing with the, how do I have it all kind of classic like feminist predicament, even though she didn't have any kind of framework she thought that was just her life. She didn't, even though this is, 1964 and these discussions are starting to happen in lower 48, according to her daughter, it was not something that was on her radar very much. And it was a real struggle for her, I think, to be just, as irrepressible of a personality as she was and as ambitious as she was, and to be, trying to work and push against, even in her work, women were expected to sort of do shows about fashion or recipe swaps, and she did all those things too. But her real passion was reporting the news. So she had a little station wagon with a mobile radio unit that she would drive around the region and file these reports. So when the quake happened, she was all set up and ready to go. This was just a very warped, exaggerated extension of the work she already did in a real crisis moment. And she became famous for it. The broadcast ended up being relayed out of Alaska through the lower 48 and around the world. So to the point where I believe it was on Sunday or Saturday night of the quake. So just the following night, some reporters from somewhere in Europe reached Anchorage, and when they got off the plane, she was surprised that they knew who she was. They had heard her voice on the radio.
yeah, great. And that's thanks to a lot of kind of really collaborative efforts by radio operators and things, which we'll talk about in a second. But before that, I wanted to just ask you a little more about the image. I keep holding up the book, but this
Oh,
cover
yeah.
image, and then there's also another cover that has this great photo of Jeannie Chance in her fur coat. Can you
Yes.
tell us about those photos and like how you came by them and sort of what they depict?
Yeah, well, the photo that on the cover that you just held up, that was that was chosen by the publisher. That's a photo of the Turnagain region of Anchorage, which at that time was the first kind of real upscale neighborhood in town. I mean, but keep in mind this is at a time that Alaska has just become a state a few years earlier. Anchorage is kind of this kind of scrappy frontier town that thinks it's a metropolis. And so anything that signals its evolution into like a real respectable community is really cherished. And one of those was this gem of a neighborhood, Turnagain by the Sea, it was called, filled with these, kind of mid-century modern homes. And that was the worst hit neighborhood with the quake because it was built on a cliff. So a big band of the entire neighborhood just sloughed down off the cliff onto the coastline. And I don't have the numbers in my mind anymore, but a great number of houses just fell. It wasn't even a question of damage. They were just gone. And yeah, a lot of the most surreal images of the quake come out of that neighborhood in terms of the way structures were bending or splitting in two and moving. The other photo that you're talking about is a really iconic photo. I used to actually have a poster of it in my office. I'm sure I had a fire in my office, ironically. So like 2 years ago, yeah. So everything was smoke damage, and I lost a lot of things. There was a stack of paperbacks of the book that were right near where the fire had started, and I now have a framed burnt up copy of the cover of my book. It seemed very appropriate. In any case, that photo of Jeannie was a promotional photo that was taken years after the quake, and it's a really gorgeous photo of her in this big fur coat with a radio microphone. And this was sort of this window of her life when she was a celebrity. She had become a celebrity after the quake, and she was flown to New York to receive awards and written up in society pages. And she was very glamorous. And she actually used that photo as the first photo on her campaign materials when she ran for the Alaska State Legislature, which she served in for almost a decade. So that, yeah, it was really just this direct link between the aura around her from what she had done in the quake and the way that she was adored, and the gratitude people felt to launching this other career.
Right. And she also ended up writing some material for the US Geological Survey. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, she wrote everything. That was one of, like, dozens of things that she produced after the quake, on relatively small scale things. But yeah, she had all of this information. And then after the quake, she was also went back to being a news reporter. So she was traveling around talking to people, and inevitably she was collecting stories of the quake as well. And so a lot of that, I don't actually, my memory is that she didn't actually prepare it for the US Geological Survey at first. She was just looking for something to do with it. But because there were so many federal officials in Anchorage, working on the reconstruction of the city, she eventually linked up with them. And that was actually the report that I first found about the quake. And how I came across her name. Just in the introduction to the report, there's a little line that says, the author was on the air for 59 straight hours, after the earthquake. And that got my sort of journalist spidey sense going. So
Sure. That's great. So tell us about the radio side of it. So Jeannie Chance was at where? Well, I won't spoil the book for anybody where she was, but tell us where she
oh,
was, what she's
we can
doing, and
put,
then how
yeah,
she,
but
yeah.
she was actually she was driving downtown with her oldest son when the quake hit. It was, it struck just as the sun was going down on Good Friday night, and they were actually scrambling into town. As a working parent, like, I totally understand, identified with this when, you think your day's over, and then her son said, "Oh, I need to go get this book downtown. I forgot I need it for my class tomorrow morning." So they rush downtown and they're sitting at a traffic light when the shaking starts. And because, immediately after the quake, she looked around. The first thing she looked for was whether her station, KENI, which was a radio station as well as a TV station in town. First thing she looked for was whether the TV antenna, which was on top of a building downtown, was still standing. And it was. And so she figured it's only going to be a matter of time before we're up and running again. She didn't really, like most people, didn't understand the severity of what had just happened. So she went straight to the public safety building, which was a building in Anchorage that housed its police and fire department. And after that, she didn't really leave. She was there for most of the weekend, and because that became the node of the recovery. So managing the emergency right afterward, you had police and fire departments there. That's where, ordinary people showed up trying to help. People who needed help showed up there, and she was right there. First broadcasting outside from her car, but the engineers quickly got her rigged up with a microphone inside. So she had her own desk. And the police chief, when she arrived, she thought, okay, like, I'm here to offer you my microphone so that you can, communicate with Anchorage. And the police chief said, nope, you're going to do it. And she became a kind of de facto public information officer. So, like, a lot of lines being blurred between kind of journalist and government official at that point, but that was what the community needed.
Yeah. And so then those broadcasts were actually rebroadcast. And after the first official messages, they also started sharing personal messages, right? Of people trying to get in contact with each other. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, it was all happening more or less simultaneously. I mean, at first it was just, we need a doctor here, we need diesel fuel for this generator. Just people were just coming up to her and telling her things, and she'd repeat them. And but very soon, as people started trickling toward the center of town and the public safety building from neighborhoods like Turnagain or places where there'd been a lot of damage, people were coming up to her because she was someone that they knew, even if they didn't know her personally, and she was on the radio and asking them, I'm looking for, my kids. A lot of it was people looking for family members who they had lost in these homes that had gone over the cliff in Turnagain. Maybe they weren't home, but their kids were, or, a husband looking for a wife and so forth. And she didn't know what to do. There was no, it seems so obvious in retrospect, but it was actually a thought process for her to figure out, like, okay, I guess I can do this. I guess this is something I can offer the city. And there were, hundreds of these messages that she relayed. And without her even knowing it, the KENI broadcast was patched through to a sister station up in Fairbanks, who then were able to relay that other places. One of the ways was just, from what I understand, someone in Fairbanks called a radio station in Seattle and just held his phone up to the radio, and the radio station in Seattle started broadcasting that feed. There was a lot of ham radio operators in Alaska. That was a big hobby for Alaskans. It was just sort of a way to connect with people. And they set up little units, outside the public safety building to communicate with Genie, and then they would bounce those messages further. So you see just these really like ad hoc organizations of people snapping together. And yeah, it was very, it's amazing to, all these years later to actually be able to piece some of those together. But I could. I mean, there's many more I couldn't piece together, but there were a few that I did.
Yeah, that's very cool. I then wonder, so all of this is going on, and where did the disaster researchers come in, and how did you learn about them in the first
Yeah. Yeah. So I learned about the center through, there was a presidential commission. I believe that's right. It was, yeah, the Lyndon Johnson established this commission to study the quake from, all different, I think there was a 5-volume report that was the product of it. And it was everything from, all different kind of scientific lenses on what had happened. And one of them was a sociological lens. So I first found that volume on the quake, which included a narrative of, I believe, the first couple days in Anchorage, which was, a kind of like, I mean, it was pretty extensive, but it was very sort of like in terms of the official maneuvering, like what was the mayor doing here, things like that. And that was assembled by Corantelli and a few other people at the center, and that was a product of all of these interviews. And I thought, I mean, that was, as a reporter, that's sort of like a gem of a resource to find, because it was giving very concrete information about what happened when. And then I saw in the notes of that this note that it was established or it was created using all these 500 some odd interviews. And I thought, well, if I could get those, now it's not just who is doing what, but sort of, what did they sound like? How did they feel? Kind of more of the storytelling aspect of it. So that was my introduction to the center. I called the Ohio State University first. And, I had never heard of the DRC before, and then spoke to I guess it wasn't you, it was Pat at that time in the archive. And very quickly, I couldn't believe that everything was still there. A lot of it was still on reel-to-reel tapes, which I couldn't access, but the transcripts were still there for many, almost all the interviews. I think there were 1 or 2, I think, that had gone missing, but and it was incredible. So I first came to the archive, I believe, in early 2017 or late 2016. I just came for a day. I was on the East Coast for doing other reporting, and just wanted to see, if it was true. Basically, it sounded too good to be true. And read a few of the transcripts. And interestingly, it wasn't just, what surprised me was that as I read more and more of them, because I came 2 or 3 more times, that I started to realize that the sociologists themselves were an interesting storyline, that they were, in a sense, they became characters in the book, because you could see them in their sides of the interview. You could track their thinking, and you could track their sort of preconceptions of what they thought they'd be there looking for, changing in real time. So this was the first big full-scale project. There had been a previous one, I believe it was a dam break in somewhere in California, and then a bleacher collapse at a state fair. I remember that one. That was like the smallest scale one. And those projects, as I understood them from talking to people at the center, were more like proof of concept, like just what kind of tools will we need to do this? What kind of questions should we be asking? But when they got to Alaska, it was like, a disaster of a completely different scale. And even, when they first, the 2 people that landed first were 2 graduate students, Bill Anderson and Daniel Yutzi. It's Bill Anderson, right? Did I get that
right?
right?
Yeah.
So they come first. They're the advanced team, and just as soon as they get set up, you see they're actually, there's a transcript of them just testing out their recorder and kind of making notes about what they were seeing. And they were like, you know what, we should have brought a radio. Like everything's happening on the radio. Like we got to add that to the kit. Or they come right off, and Yetzi's he pulls out his recording, he starts interviewing the guy at the airline gate, like when they get off the plane at this Air Force base. And it was amazing to watch how, like, with what a thud many of their questions landed, that they were coming to this situation from a very theoretical point of view. And they kept saying, like, well, who you're here making hundreds of sandwiches with these 20 other people, like, who told you to do that? And they'd be like, well, I don't know, people needed to eat. And they kept kind of slamming up against the reality of the lived reality, which was just that, like, a bunch of Alaskans being like, I guess we better make some sandwiches. And they thought, you just quickly got the impression that because there was a sort of Pentagon funding, and a lot of what they were doing was with in this kind of command and control mindset, that they were coming into Alaska. And I may be reading too much into it, but my impression was that they were coming to Alaska thinking that they were going to be basically filling out a flow chart of, this is what happened and this is why it happened, and here's whether it worked or not. And in fact, it was like the flow chart was all just like scribbled and scrambled, and it was just a thousand different decisions made by ordinary people in real time that had led to this result. And that to me was, it was so fascinating. I had read Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell, which covered some of the same research, and had always been just really taken by all that. And I thought, like, oh wow, just like as someone who's telling a story about this earthquake, now these people have just literally walked into the story I'm telling. And it would be, it just adds so much to have that, as a journalist, especially in a long project like a book, you're trying to tell a story about real people doing real things in real time, and then you're also trying to have some kind of take on it, or some kind of thinking about it too. And here I had these brilliant people doing the thinking who were also part of the story, right? So it allowed me to sort of fuse it all together in a way that I felt really, really grateful for.
That's great. And so in this case, Quarantelli is Enrico Henry Quarantelli, just for the oral history
Oh,
record.
sorry.
No, it's okay. Founder of the center. Dan Yetzi was a graduate student, but in the role of field director at the time, I believe. And then Bill Anderson was a graduate student, as you mentioned. So I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about your impressions of the three of them, and kind of how they work together, your understanding of it as best you saw, if there's any interesting thing there. And also, am I correct in remembering that you talked to Dan Yetzi's son at some point? Or
Yes. Yeah.
background information? So
Yes, I did.
anything,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
I would love to hear about the three researchers and kind of how you thought about their.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because at that time, I mean, there's really no indication in the materials that I was working with originally, um, that Yahtzee or Anderson were anything but kind of like low level, people. Like they were like I was so taken by Yahtzee is, he's talking to someone and he's like, yeah, they called me in the middle of the night and I threw on my duds and I got on the plane. Like he's clearly just like I mean, I think they only had 3 or 4 graduate students at the time. And they were the ones that they were going to stick on a plane to Alaska just to see what it was like, whether they could, whether the real scientists could even get there, basically. Um, and I guess, Yahtzee left the field eventually. I think he became a minister at some point, or ordained in some way. I can't remember. He was a really fascinating guy. He was, raised in the Amish community. His son told me. And then Anderson, of course, I learned went on to be this real titan of the field himself. But yeah, at the time I was really, it really read to me like a really colorful group of people with an interesting group dynamic. Like I could almost imagine it as almost like a Mad Men like TV or series or something. The characters are so distinct, and it was very clear to me that Yahtzee was, the hierarchy was sort of Yahtzee, then Anderson. Anderson was like the sidekick, which, as I read and talked with more people who knew him, I think also came out of just him at that time, by his own admission in some interviews I read, just being a very kind of not so confident about his abilities. He'd grown up in somewhere in Ohio. Where was Goodyear? Dayton, I believe. He'd grown up in a very working class community as a black man, and did not really necessarily feel like he belonged at this institution yet. Um, and whereas Dan seemed much more, I'm calling him Dan as if I knew him, but he seemed much more personable, and he was always the one chatting up people first and rolling tape on him right away, and very kind of like in a very lovely, geeky kind of way, just throwing whatever questions he wanted at them. And then Corintelli was, I mean, I don't need to tell anyone who's watching this that, but I was just fascinated by the man, both in his ideas and his personality. And to think, that I mean, it said so much to me that he basically decided when he got there, he was going to just park himself in the public safety building and watch the authorities. So you had, the grad students were out in the city talking to ordinary people, and he was there observing the police. And he took all of these notes, which were all preserved in the archive. And it was like, 2 or 3 days later that he notes that, if someone finally asked me who I am and what I'm doing here, so yeah, yeah, like, just as, I mean, I can't separate it from just a person who was writing this book, but as a person who was writing this book, like, they were just this tremendous gift, like, in terms of their thinking, but also them as characters in a book. Like, they were so fun to write, and it added so much to the whole story.
Yeah. And so they interviewed Jeannie Chance, right? At one point. And did you access that interview and you were able to?
Yes, so that interview was, they interviewed her a few times. They often interviewed people 2 or 3 times. And they interviewed her 3 times, I believe. And that interview was one of the ones actually that had not been transcribed. And I'm struggling to remember how it was. I think there was maybe that you had some funding to digitize some
Mhm.
things, and I think that was, I had sort of begged you to make that one of the ones that you did
Yeah,
in your
yeah, yeah,
pilot program. So
yeah,
yeah, so I was able to hear that one actually. I think it was one of the only ones I was able to hear. Um, and yeah, and it was interesting because even in there, I don't think she, frankly, I don't think she did a good job of expressing how important she'd been to them. And I don't think they were necessarily, um, primed to think that she would be that important just because of the times. And because they also interviewed all of the head of the station and a lot of the male newscasters who were, to be sure, were doing just as incredible things, but I don't, they didn't do it sort of in as a concentrated way and with as high a profile as she was doing it. Um, and so yeah, it was not really captured in the archive, the degree to which she had played this role. That much more came, you could see that in totality, but her interviews were relatively ordinary. They were it was just like any other person who said, here's what I was doing. And I think they kind of missed the bigger story about her in terms of like the impact she had outside the community too. I mean, I assume they must have known, but they may not have known sort of at that time when they were actually talking to her. A lot of the things, kind of the story of the quake, kind of was pieced together gradually afterward in the media. So
yeah, yeah. Well, good news. You told the story later on.
yeah,
So
I guess, yeah. Yeah.
this is good. Great. So, I want to talk a little bit about other disasters you might have thought about or read about. And I know you've done some like more recent things, but um, can you tell us a little bit about working with Jeannie Chance's family records and like what that experience was like and what did they have?
Yeah, they had so much stuff. I mean, she had really saved everything. I think that was just the sort of person she was. And then also, after the quake, I think relatively soon after the quake, she started to have the idea that she should write a memoir or autobiography. So she saved everything for that. She ultimately was, she had dementia very early. I'm sorry, Alzheimer's, very early in life. I think in her early 60s maybe, so she didn't get to do that. But for that reason, her archive was exhaustive. It was not well organized. You would have been very upset. But yeah, it was her daughter Jan, who was her only surviving child, both of her sons had passed away quite young. Jan had actually moved a couple times from Alaska to various places in the lower 48 and back, moving this archive with her, these 38 boxes of material, just because she didn't know what she was supposed to do with it. She didn't want to look through it even. It was too, I think it was painful, but it was also just a drag. Like it's just a bad, not a great way to spend a Saturday. Like it's annoying. And they're all in her basement in this kind of utility closet. And so, yeah, over the course of days, probably 3 separate visits, I would just sit in Jan's basement and one box at a time go through everything. And it was loosely organized by year or years. But within that, there was no telling what you were going to find. You could find, there was stuff from her childhood, everything from a lock of her baby hair and childhood photos and school projects and things like that. And then in the years she's working at the radio station, it would be personal letters mixed with promotional materials for the station or a menu for some dinner she went to. Or I found all of this material from the JFK assassination, like material that it's been sent to the station, I guess, from they were an NBC affiliate loosely. So it was, graphics to show on TV about, where Oswald had been and transparencies and things like this. You just didn't know. And a lot of it wasn't even clear what it was. There'd be photos that were unlabeled and things like that. I loved it though. I just loved it, and it just, it became a process of, photographing everything, trying to, spreadsheet. I'm not a spreadsheet person. Suddenly I was a spreadsheet person and just doing my best. I'm not an archivist. I didn't have a system for doing it or anything like that. But just slowly making a timeline of everything. And the letters were obviously, some of the best stuff because she would send these letters to her parents and her siblings. She would make copies of the letters and send them. And they were just chronicles of, the life in Alaska during that time, and what they had been doing and what the kids were up to and what work was like. So there was all that. And then at the same time, there was a lot that just wasn't captured by those materials. It wasn't until speaking to a woman who had worked with Jeannie in the legislature that I found out that her husband abused her. There was a lot of domestic violence in the house. She never wrote about that. That wasn't, put down anywhere. Her daughter spoke to me about that as well, but it just so happened I heard it from someone else first. And yeah, and unfortunately, there weren't a lot of people who could talk to me about her as contemporaries. There just weren't. And the ones who did know her, I had a lot of conversations with people who, mostly men who were her age, who it really was clear they just had like the slimmest understanding of who she was. So yeah, that was hard for me. It was hard, the idea that, I'm used to being able to call people up and talk to them about their life, or at least call other people up. So it was a challenge, but there was so much in that archive that I still feel like there was I could do a really lively portrait, I think. Yeah.
That's great. So talking about that, just kind of thinking about sort of writing about difficult topics and disasters, but also all the stuff that comes along with disasters, right? I wonder if you have any general thoughts about that, just kind of from your experience and thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on what exactly we're talking about. I mean, I've done some like reporting on disasters that, that are actually current like that. But in terms of something like, I mean, I guess I find that, and this is another reason I was really grateful to have the sociologist piece of this, is, once you know those things, once you're kind of like a little bit acquainted with how sociology understands these events, it's very hard to read a newspaper story about a flood and not, kind of shake it and be like, well, yeah, but that happens every time, or whatever it is. So I mean, I'm always telling you, like, I feel like I could have had this alternate life as a sociologist. I'm just like sticking with all this information, but
Yeah.
so to me it feels like, especially in an era where like there's just going to be more of these things happening. If we can't think about them as if we just keep thinking about them as these singular disruptions, and instead of sort of a part of the fabric of life, it I don't know how much longer that's even going to be credible. Like I feel like eventually people will have that same feeling I'm describing, where it's just like, well, I just read about this other one, and it's like, and they also did it, and they had the same problem with FEMA, and there were also these people. So I don't really know, just in terms of how to write about them. I just feel like there's such an imperative to be able to put them in context instead of reporting them just as news. Like this thing happened that doesn't usually happen. And I don't really know what the point of that kind of reporting is anymore. And yeah, so I guess in some ways that's my answer, is like, it's just, I don't exactly know what to say about writing about disasters, except for that, like, it should probably be very different. Yeah.
That is a helpful
Yeah.
take, I think. A lot of people agree, probably.
Yes.
And so I did know that you have had developed a little bit more of a sociology interest. Is there anything you want to say about that? That would be.
I don't know, I did so I did a big project for the New York Times Magazine about COVID,
Mhm.
where this archive at Columbia, the oral history project they were doing, um, where it was a very similar process to the Quake research, actually, in terms of just reading these interviews that had been done and trying to put some kind of story around them. And I think that's what I was just, like, it was just funny because I heard from sociology, I was writing about like Durkheim, and like, it was just like all these ideas were coming up because I was having conversations with the sociologists running the project, and they kept trying to put some kind of, some frame around it from the literature, what they were seeing. And so I was trying to do that too, in the same way I'm saying, like, what would be the point of just saying, like, yeah, COVID happened, and a lot of people were miserable, and here's some quotes from people in the oral history thing who were miserable, and this one was happy and she made bread or whatever. So I just felt like there needed to be some way to approach it that would be worthwhile, that would and I think with COVID especially, it was, no one wanted to do that, right? It was, I mean, in some sense, the project was like doomed from the start, because it was like the whole point of this thing is like, this crazy thing just happened, and we don't there's seems to be an impulse in society to not want to think anymore about it. And this is actually at the point where we might actually be able to think about it with some clarity, as opposed to, in the summer of 2020. So I don't know, it was, I heard from a lot of sociologists who thought it was, who were grateful and thought it was great, but were also very amused of how much kind of sociological literature was woven into the piece. But to me, I think that's, I actually say in that piece, Ryan Hagen at Columbia, who was one of the people doing this archive, said to me at one point that and I quote him in the piece, as saying something like, that the value of sociology is to show us as, show that whatever we're struggling with is within some larger forces of society, and we're not just this archipelago of individuals, sealed in our own circumstances. And I felt that experience, like looking at that archive, of feeling like, oh yeah, I relate. Like, I can think of my own experience of the first phase of COVID, and I can see how, someone, this paper really does speak to it. If I can kind of, I'm not an academic, so I have to kind of peel off all the language, but if I can do that, I can see that there's these sort of truths that are much larger than me and whatever was happening in my house.
Yeah. Yeah. So I did want to ask you about COVID. This book actually came out right around 2020, and
Yeah.
unfortunate timing for a book release. And I feel like personally it didn't get the attention that it should have had, but
I appreciate.
it's
I feel that
okay.
way. I feel that way.
But did you want to say anything else about COVID and maybe parallels? Did you find any parallels between the Alaska earthquake or other disasters you've looked at and the COVID pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, will probably be trying to figure that out for the rest of my life. But yeah, the book came out on March 22nd of 2020, I believe. So it was like literally the week many things were shutting down. And it was interesting because there seemed to be interest in the book, because of that, it was speaking to, I mean, the whole theme of the book is just that there's a kind of stability we take for granted, and just by chance it can be upended. And then what do you do once that happens? And so, in a way, people were the weirdly prophetic was the phrase that I kept hearing, that like, I'd written this book that was basically describing the sensation that people were dealing with. Um, that said, it was just a terrible time to try to actually sell copies of a book, but lots of people wanted to talk to me about it. So yeah, I think it did speak to it, and it's interesting because I had an excerpt of it in the Times opinion page, like earlier in that month. It was the week like the NBA shut down and Tom Hanks had COVID. I feel like we'll have a that'll have its own label one day of like, the inflection point or something. But that weekend in the Times, I had a excerpt from the book that dealt a lot with the Disaster Research Center work, and just saying, here's what tends to happen in the emergency period. These ad hoc organizations, the people help themselves. And I never, as the months roll on, I was like, I didn't know whether to feel foolish about that or not. Like, was I sort of Pollyanna? Like, January 6th rolls around, or I'm watching, armed, unmasked people at the Michigan State Capitol, um, and I still don't know. I still don't really know. I actually got pretty seriously involved with like helping to run a vaccine clinic in my town. And I was thinking about that in terms of the book, but everything seemed to be happening on such a jumbled timeline that I don't think it mapped directly onto it. But again, it was just as I was saying about what Ryan had said about sociology in terms of the COVID piece. Like, I guess I would have probably had experienced the pandemic much differently if I hadn't had all this like uploaded into my brain right at the get-go.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so then after you visited the center and used the materials, did you meet with Dr. Corntelli at any point while you were there? Was he there?
No, he had already passed away.
Okay.
Or no,
Okay.
I guess he'd passed away sometime between my first and second visit.
Yeah, he was not there for very long, I don't think.
Yeah.
But you ended up actually writing this really amazing piece for the New York Times Magazine about Dr. Corntelli in the lives they lived. Do you want to tell us about that? Kind of what you
Yeah, that was in 2017, I think, right? That was the year he passed away, and the magazine every year at the end of the year does this issue about kind of notable people that have died who aren't necessarily like, the biggest, name people. Some of them are, but the kind of the jewels of that issue are always the people that, you may not have heard of, but who have, you felt their impact on society in one way or another. And I think he completely fit that bill. And that was great because I talked to a lot of his students for that piece, including Trisha, who co-directs the center. And I had already I included some of the material. I think that's the lead of the piece, that story I told before about him sitting in the police station and how long it took people to ask him what he was doing there. But yeah, that was, I felt like that was even in 2017, there was a sense that we're living in an age of kind of accelerated frequency of disasters, and all of those ideas, and all of the questions that he was asking suddenly felt really, really timely.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, two more questions.
Yeah,
Can
yeah.
be done. If you have time. So one, have you learned anything new or interesting about the Alaska earthquake since you wrote the book?
Hmm. Um, I'm sure I have. Like, part of the really the worst part of the timing of the book coming out was that all of the like appearances and the book tour basically was canceled. So I was supposed to be up in Alaska doing a lot of those events, and that was really what I was looking forward to. I was looking forward to, as many people as I had talked to who had lived through the quake, I was really looking forward to like being at a bookstore somewhere and hearing all those stories again.
Yeah.
And I do feel like I was deprived. Like, I would probably have much better answers to this question if that happened. So I don't know. I'm trying to think if, and I'm sure I've learned new things, but I don't know that I've learned anything that so has such a great impact on anything we've been talking about.
That's
Have
okay.
you learned anything new? Was there something that I should know?
I learned a lot from your book, and I
Yeah.
did learn, I'm trying not to talk because this is your oral history, but I have learned, I did want to tell you that since I was looking back through some historic stuff ahead of the 60th anniversary, and I did learn that they eventually stopped sending tape recorders into the field because the thing that you talked about with students, the thing that you talked about where they were saying like, I guess we should go to the whatever, and they were like discussing. It
Uh,
turned out that later on that made the transcriptionist crazy, and so they
uh,
stopped allowing people to take the tape recorders because they would just leave it on in the car or at dinner or
Yeah, yeah.
whatever.
I mean,
And
there was a lot of that. I mean, and it
yeah,
was great for me because you would pick up these. I mean, there were clearly times when I wouldn't have been surprised if it was running by accident. Like I
yeah,
never like a whole conversation they had with this guy who was driving them into town, you know.
yeah,
Yeah, it's perfect, you know. Like as a reporter, it's like I always just I want as much as I can get, you know. So
yeah,
just
yeah.
for
Yeah,
everyone.
yeah,
That's it.
Dr. Frontelli was making a recommendation about tape recorders to somebody else on another project in this
Mhm.
thing, and then he said like, but also like you may not want to send a tape recorder because the transcriptionists really
Interesting.
don't like it.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that was good, I thought. And then just the last question I wanted to ask you is really kind of broadly, I think about, do you think there are some kinds of, so you talked a little bit about disaster reporting a little while ago. Do you think that there are some kinds of sort of untold stories about disasters or disaster history that might be out there, or some threads that people haven't picked up that you think might be good future direction?
Yeah, I mean, I'm still convinced like there's probably, dozens of more books just sitting in your archive, like to be written, you know?
Agreed.
So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do find that, I'm very aware that, from the little kind of reporting I've done with, or conversations I've had with sociologists working now, that, that there's so much I don't know, that to think that because I read all this stuff written in the 60s that I have any inkling of, but yeah, so I've been really interested in just kind of it feels to me like that there's the just the idea of sort of like an accident, like what we think of in popular culture as an accident. And I remember this like happening during Katrina, like that was, I guess I was just sort of at a certain age then too, where I was becoming a little more savvy about the way the world worked. But just hearing people be like, like there's a reason the levee broke, like it wasn't, um, or whatever it was, just like kind of seeing these things within bigger forces. I feel like obviously there's tons of people looking at the world in much more nuanced ways, and ways that are stressing sort of like this idea of equitable and inequitable, um, disasters basically, and that to me feels like, an idea that in the same way that just like people help people in disasters, like that is just sort of like once you know that you can't help seeing it, like this piece to me also feels like just as, like a personal paradigm shift for a lot of people. So I'm not very well read on any of that, but I feel like, I would like to be, and I feel like that's not at all something that was included in the research in this book. I mean, it was included in the story in the sense that you had that playing out, but it wasn't being, intellectualized or evaluated with the same kind of intelligence.
Well, come back and visit our collection anytime. We'll
Yeah, yeah,
set you
yeah,
up with a lot of material. Okay.
yeah,
Well, this has been great. We'll go ahead and stop the recording. Thank you so much for
yeah.
this.
Thank you.
We're
Yeah.
really glad to do it.
Oh, no, me too. I'm glad. I'm sorry I can't be there, but
Oh,
yeah.